Hello, Internet. It's Drew. Welcome to my new and improved basement. I finally got off my tail and did something with this place, and I think it's a lot better. So hopefully I can bring you less visually unpleasant videos from now on. But that said, I want to launch straight into today's topic, which is the third of the three pillars of good D&D, according to me, which is narrative. The first one is a heroic tone, the second one is an epic scope, and the third one is a narrative-based progression, a storyline. This may not seem very controversial to people now. The default way of playing D&D has very much become about persistent narrative for many groups. I feel like, the rise of Critical Role and other Let's Play stuff like that, it seems like that's the default model that most people are following. Even that said, playing back in the 90s in high school, we still had storylines. We still structured things around a central plot. We were playing a lot of 16-bit RPGs like Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy V and Secret of Mana and Zelda 3. So we tended to imitate those games' progression in our D&D game. So we had storylines and persistent antagonists and character plot arcs and everything, even back then. But that said, this is maybe seems on the surface like a pretty uncontroversial take and an uncomplicated one. Like, why would your D&D game want to have a storyline in it? What else are you going to do with the game? The whole point is to collaboratively build a story together. Like, without that, there is no D&D. But I feel like it's worth dissecting and pushing into a little bit deeper this topic, because there's quite a lot going on under the surface. So I'm going to list off a few reasons and a few benefits and the ways that narrative can be used in your campaign that maybe people haven't thought of so much or hasn't been covered as much. So going from roughly the simplest to roughly the most complicated of these reasons. The first reason, why should you have a storyline in your campaign? Because humans are a storytelling species. It is a core mechanic to our species. It's the way that information has been passed down for thousands of years. We tell stories, we have legends, we have myths. All of these things are part of our culture and have been for so long that it is instinctive. And even if you look at our entertainment now, it's all stories, right? Movies are stories, books are stories, stage plays are stories, D&D stories. Everybody knows what a story is and more or less how to interact with it. When you have that mechanism present in your game, it allows people to have an immediate common ground. That also helps with new players, maybe people who aren't that familiar, who sit down at the table for the first time and go, wow, there's all these terms like armor class and hit points, and they have all these funny shaped dice, and there's little miniatures and all these complex looking character sheets, and I don't know how any of this stuff works. Oh, but there's a story. I know how stories work. I can hook into that. And the story is the mechanic, the central thread that allows these people to then branch out and learn the game built around it, right? So it's very important from that point of view. It's kind of like the glue that holds all of your, the rest of the whole thing together. The second reason is that the pillars that I've been talking about, the three pillars of good D&D, this narrative pillar reinforces the other two. They all reinforce each other in the sense that your storyline is the thing that allows the players to explore the epic scope of your campaign. It's the thing that allows them to progress and hit against the edges and understand what it's like to have conversations with immortals and fight demons and ride dragons and do all that cool stuff that only happens after a long progression, or only feels earned and worthwhile after a long progression. If you don't have a central storyline that will take your players from being grunts in the dirt all the way up to this epic future, then it's difficult to conceive for me of another way that we could arrive to that, that state, that endgame state. The story is the thing that lets the players explore the limits of the epic scope, and it is the thing that allows them the time to perform the heroic deeds necessary to create the heroic tone that we have been talking about. The longer the story goes on, the more opportunities there will be for acts of heroism, and the higher the stakes get, because the more work the players have done to make the world a better place, the more invested they are in it, and the worse it is when the bad guys do something to threaten it, right? So this helps the whole game evolve and become more and more immersive over time. The third thing is that having a persistent storyline with recurring villains and locations and all this sort of stuff, if the world is built around the story, and I'll get to this more detail later, then chances are they're going to come back to places. They're going to revisit locations. They're going to see people again and again. They're going to form relationships with NPCs. That whole thing allows the DM to actually have a stake in the game. It's one of the main ways that the DM can also buy into the shared narrative. It's not just the players that create this. The DM is a player too. The storyline and the recurring events and the things that the DM shapes, those are the ways that the DM can communicate with the game. That's the only way, really, that we have a way of interfacing with it or like influencing. We're not just there to create a passive backdrop that you do everything in. We are part of it as well. So the storyline is very important from that point of view too. That's a little bit more, I guess, outside the box of the way that people normally think about storylines in games, especially if you're used to coming from like a PC gaming kind of background where the storyline is baked and shipped and you kind of like, you don't interact with the creators of it at all, really, except maybe in the case of MMORPGs. But even then, like the feedback loop is so distant because you might, like a bunch of players might complain on the forums and then that gets back to the design team and the design team makes some changes and then it comes back in the game like, 6 months later or whatever in a patch. And it's just not the same as like the D&D game where the feedback is basically immediate, right there. So this leads on neatly to probably like one of the less vocalized, I think, and probably more complicated aspects of this, and that is that having a persistent storyline, that immersion, and that ongoing increasing level of buy-in, that creates a trust loop between the DM and the players between each other as well. It's a fundamental thing of everyone at the table trusting the game, trusting that game state. The longer it persists, the more you can buy into it, the more you trust it, the more comfortable you will feel to step outside your boundaries, to do things, to role play, to come up with crazy ideas, the more that you will be part of this thing and you take, in a sense, like responsibility for its ongoing health and evolution. And like on the player side of things, that can be literally just the confidence to know that they aren't going to get punished by the DM for doing interesting, cool things. This is why it's very important for the DM to be on the side of the players, to be their biggest cheerleader and to kind of go, I've given you this challenge that I think is borderline impossible, and I can't wait to see the ways that you guys come up with to deal with it, right? That's the vibe, I think, or at least that's the vibe that I try for when I'm DMing. So yeah, the longer this goes on, the more you signal to your players that they can trust you to, and this ties into a very important concept that I'm going to go into later when we talk a little bit about like how to actually build these stories, not why this stuff is important. But the more that they are able to see that their adventurous story will continue and you will do everything in your power to make sure that it goes as long as possible, then they are more likely to reciprocate that and you all build up this state of trust, which is just glorious. It's the most amazing thing when you get that in a table. It's very rare. I've only had it a couple of times in my life and it was genuinely like one of the most special things that I think you can create with other human beings. I'll put it that way. Those are some reasons about why story is important to include and why narrative is important for your campaign. Let's talk about how to actually build D&D narrative, because it is not the same as writing a book, writing a screenplay, any other medium really that I can think of, except for possibly improv comedy, doesn't have this interactivity, this way that like the people who are taking part in the activity can influence the outcome on the fly as the thing evolves. You can't yell at a movie because something happens that you don't like. Well, I guess you can do that, and I have done that, but it's not going to change anything, right? Like, but in terms of the game, you can say, no, actually, I think I'm going to do this. And then the world has to kind of, within reason, has to like change, and the story has to change to accommodate your actions. The freedom given to you means that this thing is, like, in terms of writing a storyline, is probably one of the more challenging things to design narrative for that I can think of. This is like enough for a whole separate video on its own, like how to write D&D narrative, maybe even like a series, because it's a big topic. But bullet point list I can think of. We always get hung up on the sandbox versus railroad thing. I don't think the answer is either of them. I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. It's not absolute freedom, aimless sandbox, which personally frustrates the hell out of me. Like, if you need to know where my personal bias is with this, I will take a pretty fun railroad any day over an aimless sandbox. I want to take part in a story. I want to like put my heart into something and get involved with something. I don't want to be dumped in the middle of a desert and say, well, you figure it out. You tell me what you want to do. I've built this environment. You run around like a little Minecraft dude and like build the adventure yourself. No, the DM is responsible for giving the players the adventure, taking them away, whisking them away on this thing. And their reaction informs your next action and so on and so on. So my personal bias is railroad. But that said, it is not D&D if there's no free choice. It is not D&D if the players don't get to choose what to do. If you're telling them, if you're predetermining outcomes, if you're deciding things ahead of time, that's not D&D. That's you basically reading your players your fan fiction. So the way I think of it is that you want to railroad with stations, right? Especially in the day of VTTs, the amount of prep needed for sessions. If you go and prep some, elaborate encounter with a beautiful battle map and tokens, or like, when we were playing my last campaign, I would paint miniatures and make terrain and do the whole thing. And if you go and do that, all that work, and then the players are like, no, we're not going to go there. We'll just do something else. Then, like, you're not going to play. You're basically going to be like winging something crap. When you could have all just, like, if you just all agreed on the contract and gone, yeah, that looks awesome, I'm going to go fight that battle, that looks really cool. So from that point of view, there has to be a compromise between the freedom of choice and the the sanity and time of the DM to cater to that choice. So the way I think of it is that you're standing at a station and the players can choose that train, or that train, and they all go to different places. Those 3 tracks are set. Whichever track they choose, that's the next section of railroad. It doesn't change. They have to ride that section of track to the next station. They can't get off. They can't go back. They can't do any of the rest of it. That bit's set, right? So they get into that thing. They go to the next station. They experience that bit of stuff that you build. And that means that, I can hear the screaming already from the internet, but bear with me, because that means that you can make that piece of track really nice, right? You can make it an awesome, really... You can think about it a lot. You can think about the way that it ties into the storyline, the kind of things that could happen there. You can plot background music. You can design, like I said, make terrain, paint miniatures, come up with battle maps, do all this kind of really cool stuff to make it a really beautiful section of railroad with a very high production value, which also helps your immersion, helps people buy in more. So they go on that section of track, they get to the next station, and then there's another choice. So this is a nice compromise, I feel, between freedom of choice and just the practicalities of building the game around those choices. You cannot, I don't think, have a high production value game, which I think is important. I don't really want to run a game that looks like ass. I want to run something that looks amazing. So from my point of view, that's the best way, the best compromise. Railroads with stations. The second thing that I can suggest is to unlink death from defeat. Just because your players get defeated doesn't mean they all have to die. This is right. It's to the point where now if I design an adventure, or I think about a progression of maybe a combat encounter or something, I will think at the end, I have literally a template that I have for my adventures, and part of the combat encounter template is how can I possibly explain the players not getting killed if they lose this fight? What happens if everybody screws up? What happens if you have one of those evenings where you can't roll over a 3 and the players just get absolutely wrecked? How can this be salvaged? And that's quite a cool exercise in itself, because to think of ways that aren't contrived, like you can't have the City Watch just turn up every time the players get defeated and fish them out of trouble. Right? Otherwise, players are going to cotton on really quick, and that will completely destroy the stakes, and then immersion is impossible. So thinking of creative ways to go like, okay, maybe there's an avalanche, maybe there's a flash flood, maybe there's, I don't know, maybe they get kidnapped and held for ransom instead of murdered. Maybe they get sold as slaves. I don't know. Whatever it is, right? But there might be a million ways that you can explain something happening. This is also incidentally why I suggest caution when plotting encounters with wild animals, because the wild animals will typically just eat the players. That's the only rational thing that you can say that will happen there. And everybody's like, oh, just have them fight some bears and wolves and stuff. And it's like, no, actually, that's probably one of the worst things you can do, because at least if they're fighting humanoids who might be motivated by greed or some other thing, there's a sliver of a chance that you can, explain a defeat away. Overwhelmingly, the game is weighed in the player's favor anyway. Mechanically, like all the percentages are slightly in the player's favor. They have a million ways to get rerolls and boost their rolls and get bonuses and all that kind of stuff, right? But just have in the back of your head this idea, okay, what happens if they get defeated? And is there a way, like you basically are asking yourself the question, can I do anything to make this story continue, even if there's a setback? Right? Because the story is the thing that has to continue. In a way, like death for a character is like the most boring possible outcome that you can have, because they just end and they stop contributing to the shared game state. They stop contributing to the world. And that's it. And then the player has to go away making a new character. They're away from the table for a while. They're left out of the action. The DM has to like come up with some contrived reason why that new PC is joining the group. It just sucks. Better to avoid it, right? So if your mathematics and your game balancing and your monster damage and all the rest of these things fail, and the players, don't just have a horrible night and they can't roll over a 3, then you got to think about how to deal with that and still turn that into a graceful state of failure that can be recovered and moved on from. Not without cost. No one said they can't have scars. No one said they can't have consequences for losing, for being defeated. But those consequences are a lot more interesting to play out than the players just dying and you starting over or whatever. Especially if you've done something embarrassing like signal that they might be chosen ones, scions of famous adventurers or descendants of, people who are ordained to save the world, and then they die in a cave to an ant egg, and that's it, right? So unlink death from defeat. Second tip. Third tip is don't build a world and hope the PCs do something cool in it. Build a cool world around the PCs, right? Build your world around what the players are doing, what they want, where they are, the locations, all that sort of stuff. That's where all your world building should get the most attention. You pour all that in there so that they get, and it's important to kind of signal that there's more to the world, right? But you might not necessarily know what that is. I made a world map. Everybody does. But I have no idea what's going on over that continent over there. I haven't even thought about it because the players haven't gone there yet. When they go there, I'll think about it, right? I don't sit there spending hours and hours building out every town and village and going like, oh, these guys are like, they're on a river delta and their main export is fish and their population is like 12,000 people and it's predominantly, half orcs, but there's a significant dwarf minority there and there's some racial tension for some location that the players will maybe never visit. It seems insane to me. This is backwards. Think of it like if you're holding up a torch in a dark cave. Right, the area of light immediately around where the players are, that's the bit that should get the most world-building attention in terms of the plot, in terms of the locations, the characters that they're encountering, all that sort of stuff should be the most well-lit immediately around where they are. Then the stuff, further out, less relevant to where they are, that's dim, right? You've got maybe a hazy idea of what that is, but you haven't put too much thought into it, just a few thoughts to kind of go like, okay, I think I can develop that into something. I think I can develop that into something. So you've got a few ideas of where to go. If they go in this direction or that direction, you can light that area better. And then the stuff outside that is completely dark, at least for me. I don't know. But I have a habit of ad-libbing and making stuff up on the fly. And I think kind of like that's a core part of being a DM and a skill that gets better with practice. Like, don't think it's some natural ability that some people have and some people don't. Of course, some people are going to be better at it from the get-go, but it's like anything else. If you practice it, it will get better. Final thing that I can say is something that I noticed while I was running my campaign is that people don't remember intricate plot lines, like, vast casts of characters and noble houses embroiled in feuds that go back centuries, and names of important NPCs. People don't remember all this stuff, which is another argument against like massive intricate world building. I don't think it's actually worth it. I think the thing that people remember is awesome moments. Awesome moments, not intricate plots. Think about like the most awesome things that you can come up with for your narrative beats. And I mean, like, I had a combat encounter that occurred on a section of cliffside that the PCs had been chased onto this spur of rock that hung over a valley, and they were followed by an undead army, and the weight of the undead on the thing caused the entire thing to break off into a landslide, and then they fought this battle against the remnants of the undead army on this giant hunk of rock as it skidded down a glacier. Like, that's an awesome moment that is more memorable than Lord so-and-so, married his sister and they had a child and the child was ignored and blah, blah, blah. Like, it just goes on and on and on. This stuff. Don't think about that. Just try to push your imagination to the limit to think about the coolest possible things that you can come up with within this fantasy world, the coolest moments that you can put into your storyline, and then do the work to embed them in a way that makes sense. Right, they're not just like, oh, you meet in the tavern and there's a dragon outside, right? Like, you have to think about it and really think about ways to embed them into your campaign so that there's a lead up, so that there's a build, so that those things are special when they happen. But the thing that I can say, and I think I touched on this in another video, but it's been a long time. You'll have to forgive me if I repeat myself. I basically have very little time, and it's very difficult to find time to record these videos. So sometimes they'll be weeks apart and I can't remember what I said in the others. Just like your ability to improvise and to think on the fly, your ability to come up with amazing ideas will only get stronger the more that you use it, right? So if you come up with some awesome idea, use it, right? I'm pretty sure I've said this in another video, but in terms of your storyline as well, it applies to the same thing applies here. If you come up with an awesome story beat, use it. Find a way to put it into your story as soon as possible. Don't hoard it. Don't hold it back. Don't go like, oh, I have to wait until that's special enough, right? All that will happen is that you put this awesome moment in, your players experience this awesome moment, they come back with something because of the awesome thing they experienced, and that will be fuel for the next awesome moment, right? It is a loop that you need to establish, and don't be scared, right? Because you will come up with, like, the part of it is pushing your imagination to come up with something even cooler the next time. And that's the fun of it, right? Like to go like, okay, that was pretty mad. How can I possibly do something as cool or cooler in the next session? How can I make this next bit memorable? Push it up, push it, push the level, push the limit. You're after maximum drama and maximum impact. And I think that as long as you think about this thing in terms of like stitching together awesome moments in a way that makes sense, rather than trying to construct some grand narrative based on a ton of detail that the players will never remember and can't be expected to remember either. Like there's a lot of threads from DMs on Reddit or whatever being like, I can't believe the PCs didn't even remember my the name of the king when they did this, but did you give them a reason to care? Is the king actually important to what they're doing? Why should they care what the king's name is? Just because he's the king? I would argue that he's not central to the story if they don't remember him. You need to make them relevant. You need to make them care. If they don't care, then that's a symptom of the fact that either that or you're playing with jerks who are deliberately like not paying attention. I'm assuming good faith, right? But if you're playing with people who want to be there and who care about the game and they can't remember stuff, then that stuff was not important. And you need to approach things differently in a way that makes it important. And that's it. So that's about all I can think of for narrative, why the narrative pillar is important, and how to just a couple of ideas for how to build it, how to put it into your game. Thanks very much for watching. Catch you later. I'm not a fan of world building.